Welcome, everyone. My name is Remko Tanis. I'm the Programs and Editorial Manager here at Asia Society Switzerland. Very pleased to see you here at our talk at the library with Karin Wenger. We'll discuss her 3 books. Let me switch off my audio. Otherwise I hear myself double. There you go. Karin was a radio correspondent for Swiss public broadcaster SRF from 2009 until just a few months ago, right?
2 months ago. Yeah.
2 months ago.
End of March, 1.5 months ago.
Yeah. So first you started out in New Delhi, then moved to Bangkok. Earlier this year, she published 3 books about the people she met during her time in South and Southeast Asia. They're Jakob der Gefangene. They're all in German, of course. Verbotene Lieder and Bis zum nächsten Monsoon. We'll talk extensively about them this hour. If you have any questions, we'll get to that later on in the second half. And before moving to Asia, you worked as a freelance journalist in the Middle East.
In the Middle East, yeah. I studied in Ramallah, and then I stayed on as a freelance journalist in Ramallah and Gaza and Israel.
Now you're back in Switzerland. You made quite a tour already with the books. Did you cover every valley and every meadow, or? Pretty
much. Yesterday I went to Appenzell.
Okay.
There was like a 2-hour train ride until I reached there. I didn't know that, can be so far in Switzerland.
With a bag full of books, of course.
Yes. No, actually yesterday not, because it was a bookshop. So they wanted to sell their own books.
Okay, so, that makes sense, yeah. You've been away for a long time from Switzerland, working abroad. How long are you planning to stay this time? Is this the next exile?
In Switzerland? Only 2 months, only for the book tour. Mm-hmm. And then actually in 2 weeks, I'm already heading out again, first to Greece and then to the Caribbean, because I'm taking a sabbatical and we bought a boat, a sailing boat. So we will go sailing for a year. Perfect.
Are you going to write 3, 4, 5, 6 books on that as well? Or?
Not sure, depends on the weather.
Okay. I was wondering, back in 2009, what made you decide to move to Delhi?
It was a total accident. At that time, or before, like a year before, I lived in Damascus, in Syria. I was working with an NGO at the Iraqi-Syrian border with refugees. And one day I got a call from the radio, and they asked me if I would like to join the radio and move to Bern. And I said, Bern, no. And then
where in Switzerland are you from originally?
Actually, it's not Bern, it's Bassersdorf, which is next to the airport. So at least since childhood, I could see the planes taking off and probably got inspired. So I said, no, I think Bern, no. And then a few months later, they called again and they said, look, we have this posting in South Asia, in New Delhi, and would you be interested? And I said, yes. And just a short while later, I signed a contract. By that time, I never had been to Asia. Okay. So it was a total new territory for me.
How did you proceed to make South Asia, India, Delhi your home? From
I have to say, before I left, there were a few moments of panic, because I realized, India, New Delhi, it's not Bassersdorf and it's not Bern. It's just
it's not even Zurich.
It's not even Zurich. It's not even Zurich. In all kind of aspects, right? It's a multi-million person inhabitants city, and weather is harsh. You have 50 degrees in summer. It's cold in winter. So I panicked in the beginning, but then when I moved there was so much to do. I just had to work. I mean, I had to set up my studio, I had to set up my apartment, and then I started to travel. And I think that's how I really kind of claimed this city and the country, by traveling extensively. So half the time before the pandemic, half the time I was traveling. I went to, this first 6.5 years, it was South Asia. So it was a lot of Afghanistan. Every year I went about 1 month to Afghanistan, Sri Lanka, Nepal. There was a major earthquake in Nepal. There was a major flood in Pakistan just in the beginning when I was there. And India is a universe itself. So India is just, I think you can spend like 10 lifetimes if you get reincarnated in India, and you will never really get to know it.
But when you arrive in Delhi with your radio contract in your pocket, how long did it take before you felt comfortable to send out a first report, knowing that you did the story justice, you knew enough about it to give a fair picture to your audience here?
I think it took about a year to feel more comfortable, because in 1 year I traveled all the countries. I already started to know a lot of people and different fields, economy, politics, social aspects. But in the end, it's like every story is new. For every story, you start from scratch, you learn again. It's a constant learning process. And then after 6.5 years, I had done a lot of Kashmir conflict reporting. So then there are some repetitions, yeah.
You mentioned a lot of travel. Of course, the last, 2.5 years, there's been hardly any travel for anyone. The world in lockdown, challenging for everyone. But as a traveling foreign correspondent, your job changes, especially dramatically, I assume.
Absolutely, yeah.
How did you spend that time?
Yeah, some of the time I spent by writing the 3 books.
Right.
And
where were you most of this period?
It was a bit complicated, because just before the total lockdown, I went to Bavaria, to Rosenheim, to meet my boyfriend. That was mid-February 2020. I wanted to go for 2 weeks, and then Thailand locked the borders and I couldn't go back for 11 months. So then there was kind of a nomadic life, which I started together with my boyfriend, Alex, and we moved from the Bavarian Alps to Switzerland, to the Swiss Alps, to the Ticino, wherever we could find a place to stay for some time. And then we moved back to Thailand, spent some time in Hua Hin because Bangkok was in lockdown, then spent more time in Bangkok. So there was still quite a bit of movement, but always in one country. And what really changed was how I worked. I mean, before, as I mentioned, I was traveling all the time.
Right.
That meant I met people in person. And while traveling, I always prepared stories, but I always left enough time that stories could develop. And that's what happens, right? If you spend some time, you see something, you observe, you meet people, they tell you stories. That's how many of my stories developed. And that was much harder by being just in one place and far away from Southeast Asia, or from many countries in Southeast Asia. So I focused more on Thailand, because I was most of the time then I spent in Thailand during the pandemic. And I did a lot of Zoom interviews, a lot of Signal interviews, a lot of phone calls.
Right.
And I think my job, I kept working, but I think my job was only possible because for 4 years before, I had traveled extensively and I had a huge network of people who trusted me and I trusted them. So I think this was key, especially when the coup in Myanmar happened last year, 1st of February. People were scared to talk as well. So it really required this network of trusted people to be able to connect with them and to report about what was happening.
We meet a good group of these people in the 3 books you wrote. So there's Verboten Lieder, which is the story of the Afghan singer-actress Mina Armani. Then we have Jacob der Gevangene, about a man named Jacob who is caught up in the Indian justice prison system. And Bis zum nächsten Monsoon, this is a collection of 6 stories in 5 countries, all featuring people who are going through quite extreme situations. We know from headlines here, but hardly ever get the chance to really dive into the story of people who live during these extreme situations. Can you tell us a bit about, no, let me rephrase that. The book, like we talked about, really gives a on-the-ground perspective to these events, beyond the headlines, to people reading it here in Switzerland, here in Europe. That's an approach very different than, for example, you spend from 2009 to 2022 in that region and decide to write this grand book on the geopolitical dynamics in the region. What is the difference between those 2, and why did you decide to go take more the human approach, the human perspective?
I think as people we connect to people, right? And we are emotional beings. And to understand geopolitics on a really physical, emotional level, you need to tell the stories through people. And that's why I always try to take this approach from the ground by meeting people. And I try to tell the bigger stories, the geopolitical stories, through these personal, smaller stories. So that was, I think through all my reporting, that was my approach. But there is perhaps a common idea through all the three books. And that was, so I met these people mainly through news reporting, earthquakes, factory collapse, political changes, a military coup, and so on. And there were two aspects. One was I reported about them. It was in the news. And a few weeks later, it was not in the news anymore. I mean, Afghanistan is the best example, right? You know, August last year, everyone wrote about Afghanistan. It was everywhere in the news. Now no one speaks about Afghanistan anymore. And this doesn't mean Afghanistan and troubles there have ended. No, it continues. So I was much more interested in how do people continue living after they totally disappear from the news? And then there was another much more personal question I had, which is how do people survive after such extreme events? One guy in this book, he was hostage by IS in Marawi in the Philippines. How do you survive that? How do you survive in such a situation? And how do you survive later, physically and psychologically? How do you not get depressed? How do you not commit suicide if you go through such trauma? So that was a very personal question I had. And I started to go back to the same people over and over again. So all of these three books, they have portraits. I portrayed people. I went back for 10, 11, 12 years, again and again and again. And yeah, it was really to see how do people do that.
In the book Verbotene Lieder, the story of the Afghan woman Mina Amani. Could you introduce us to her a little bit and tell us how you ran into her story and her as a person, of course, and why you thought I've got to keep in touch with her and tell her story?
So I met Mina, that's Mina here on the cover. I met her in April 2011 in Herat. Herat was a cultural city. It was famous for music, for art, for poetry, for literature. And I wanted to show a different side of Afghanistan. I went every year, 1 month to Afghanistan. I loved Afghanistan, to go back there. It was just, it's such a, I mean, the beauty of this country, the wildness of this country, the hospitality of the people, you just do not find that anywhere in the world. And so I love to go back there, and I wanted to show these different parts, these different sides of Afghanistan, since we mainly hear of war and conflict. And I went to Herat, and I was looking for artists to write a story about artists and art. And that's when I met Mina. Mina at that time was, I think, 22. And she had grown up as many Afghans, millions of Afghans in Iran. Many fled through the time of civil war, Taliban, before the Russians, who were occupying Afghanistan since 1979 for 10 years. Many Afghans fled to Iran and Pakistan. That's the majority where the refugees are. So she grew up in Iran. She moved back in 2001 to Afghanistan with her parents because her father said, okay, 2001, NATO troops have moved in. Now this will be the golden time for Afghanistan. That's what starts now. So she came back, and she always wanted to be a singer. She always wanted to be an artist. She wanted to be on the big stage. And she came back, and she started and became really famous with one song. And after that, she hosted Afghan Star, like a music talent show in Tolo TV, like Afghan TV.
Afghans Got Talent.
Afghanistan. And became even more famous. And then the threat started. So mainly men, obviously, but also women started saying that's not what you can do as a woman. As a woman, you have to be quiet, you have to stay at home. And she didn't want. She really wanted to live her passion and her life. And the threats became bigger and bigger. And when I met her, she said, look, in the next few days, I want to flee to Iran together with my husband. I have to flee because I'm going to get killed. And so we met. She told me her story, and I gave her my business card and said, please let me know what happens to your life. Perhaps at some point I can help in any way, or at least I know what happens to your life. And I didn't hear anything from her for 2 years. And then after 2 years, I got an email, and the email read like, hello, Miss Wenger, this is Jamal Amani. I live in Solothurn, Switzerland.
Quite a twist.
Yeah. And I'm the brother of Mina Amani. Mm-hmm. And that's how I started reconnecting to Mina. And yeah, her story in this book.
It's I mean, her brother ended up in Solothurn, not voluntarily. I mean, like
as a refugee, he fled much earlier than the rest of the family. Mm-hmm. Now everyone except Mina are in Germany as refugees, or Jamal is here in Switzerland. Yeah, and he had a different twisted story. It was honor crime, but it was different, twisted. Yeah.
What I found striking in this book is it really puts a human face on something that we pretty much only hear in 2 words: refugee crisis. Millions of people are behind those 2 words. Yeah. You portray mostly Mina, her family around her a bit. Have you the book is out a few months now, right? Have you heard from people that it changed their perspective to look at it as more of a human story instead of a crisis that comes at us as one anonymous block?
I mean, I had now over 30 readings and lectures and so on in the last 6 weeks. And I do get a lot of response from people who come to these lectures. And one response is that something touches them. And I think it is this human face people start to see. It's not just a refugee crisis now. There are people behind these refugee crises who have to live through horrible sceneries, right? And it's not a straight way. I think we often think, okay, now we see refugees here. They came in one go from Kabul or wherever. No, it's like a story. Mina's story is very exemplary. She she tried to flee from Herat to Europe. She was deported so many times from Iran, then struggled in Turkey, missed opportunity. It didn't work out. So it's like a continuous struggle, and they spend all their money. They spend everything they have because in the case of Mina, she says, look, I'm dead. If I'm deported back to Afghanistan, I'm going to be dead. I'm going to be killed.
And they spend all their money paying people to make it to Europe.
Yes.
And,
yes. We tried then in last August when the Taliban marched into Kabul and they took over Afghanistan. We all panicked a bit. Now I know the entire family of Mina, and we all got connected. I was in Thailand and they in Germany, in Switzerland, and Mina is now in Istanbul illegally. And we tried to figure out what can be done. How can we help her? And I contacted the Swiss embassy consulate in Istanbul, and I asked them, can you help Mina? I mean, she has a brother here. Most of the part of her family is in Germany. What can be done? And they said, yes, she can ask for a humanitarian visa. And in many days, we kind of collected everything. It had to be in one of the Swiss languages. So it had to be in German, French, or Italian. And we handed in her application in August last year. She had sold everything. She was waiting in an empty apartment, and she was waiting for months and months and months. She was pregnant at that time, and we knew there was like a short time frame. And then in December, she finally got the response, and it was negative. So Swiss government said, no, she's not in a. No, it's not enough.
Right.
It's not enough.
She's not
crisis
enough of a
not
risk
enough.
for
Yeah. Yeah. So you start to realize, right?
Yeah.
I started to realize we should have rather done a big fundraiser to get the money for the people who can bring her here. Because that's the chance that's the only chance most people have. and not through a legal way like a humanitarian visa.
Another very human story is in the second book. Jacob de Gevangene, who's you meet him when you do a story on yoga in Tihar prison, the biggest prison in Asia.
Yeah,
meditation. Okay. So how do you start on a story on meditation in a prison in India and end up describing Jacob's struggle with the Indian justice system?
Many of my stories developed by just coincidences and life meetings. And so when I moved to Delhi in 2009, I realized it's a hard city. It's a harsh city in many ways, and you struggle, it takes energy. So I said, okay, it's India. It's the land of yoga and meditation. Let me try that, right? To kind of get a bit more robust. And
did it work for you? Or?
Yeah, I would say, yeah, it stays with me until today, the yoga and meditation practice. So I went to the Himalayas and I did a 10-day meditation, Vipassana meditation course. It's a Buddhist meditation. So it was 10 days in silence, 10 hours of meditation per day for 10 days. And every evening they gave little lectures.
Must be tough for a radio reporter.
To be silent for 10 hours. It was beautiful. It was beautiful. I realized how much rubbish you talk the whole time, you know. It's like, it was really nice. I mean, the silence part was great. The physical part was much more hard, right? To sit and not move. And so in one of these lectures, they told us about that they also give these courses, the Vipassana meditation courses, 10 days in Tihar jail in New Delhi. And Tihar jail in New Delhi is a massive jail. They have capacity for 5,400 inmates. There are triple the amount of inmates there. And I just wondered, how does this go, right? A murderer, someone who probably sits without any guilt in jail. How do they cope sitting 10 days in silence? Because, I mean, what happens in meditation is that you think it's quiet, but then you realize how noisy it is in yourself, right? And you start talking and it starts talking and you go crazy, or you think you go crazy. So I wondered how this works for someone who sits in prison. And I said, okay, let me do a story about that. It's a wonderful radio story or a journalistic story. So I went there and went to prison administration. And I think they were thinking, that's a great PR story, right? Let her do that. And obviously no one knew at that time, and I didn't know it, that something like this would come out, which was not really a PR story in the end. And so I moved to Tihar. I went to Tihar for a one-day visit, and they took me around and they brought Jacob. And they said, okay, this is Jacob. He has done 4 Vipassana meditation courses in his time he did here in Tihar. He was still an inmate. He has been sitting there for 3.5 years. And we started talking about meditation first, but we had about half an hour. And very quickly, we started talking about the system Tihar, which was, it's a universe. It's really a universe. You can bring in everything, smuggle in everything. You can smuggle out everything. Jacob had bought a single cell for himself. Bought. Yeah, like for $1,000, I think.
Okay.
He had someone who gave him massages. He had someone who washed his clothes. And so he played the system, right? He knew how to do that. And so I was really interested in that system prison. And I suggested, let's start a pen friendship, right? I send you questions through your lawyers. He had a sister as lawyer and the blind lawyer. So there's also a nun, right? So I gave them my questions. They smuggled the questions in. They smuggled his letters out, and that's what happened through many months. And
is it normal for prisoners who have lawyers to have the lawyers be a nun and a blind person? Or is that, I mean...
These are lawyers from an NGO.
Right, okay.
Who basically look after people who don't have the money for a lawyer. Jacob was not really in that category. He was a businessman before. He still had some money now. He doesn't have any more money. But at that time, he still had some money. but he came from Kerala, from the south of India. And most of the nuns are nuns from Kerala.
Ah.
So there was this connection, and you know, that's how India works. That's probably also how Switzerland works. So if you how it works anywhere, pretty much. But what I found interesting is you write in the book how once you met Jacob and heard more of his story, besides his meditation efforts, that somehow your gut feeling told you to there's more to this, and I have to continue being in touch with him. Can you define a bit more what that gut feeling is you have as a reporter in situations like that, where you're in the biggest prison in Asia, meeting a person you didn't choose, but who was introduced to you by the prison boss? What is that gut feeling? What happened that you thought, I'm not sure. Gut feeling is gut feeling because you probably cannot articulate what's the gut feeling.
Right.
But I think what it is when I start feeling there's something true coming from a person, something from the heart, something where I really can connect to. Probably you call it in normal language authenticity, right? Something real. That's what many politicians don't have, right? They just have their set of what they have to say and they repeat it over and over again. And that's why these interviews are so boring most of the time, because you never get something real. And that's when I start to follow stories, when I start feeling, okay, there is something real, and I want to know what it is and where it comes from. And plus in that case, I felt this system, Tihar, was kind of so representative of the system India, with the corruption, with the bureaucracy. It was kind of in small, this big system. Right. And I found it interesting to tell the bigger Indian story through this prison system.
Just a little sidestep, but you mentioned how politicians lack the authenticity often. I believe it's also in the book Jacob de Gevangene, where you briefly talk about your lunch with the Sri Lankan president.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's
the same guy who's still here now? Or
it was Mahinda Rajapaksa.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, now it's Gotabaya, right? His brother. Right?
Yeah.
That's a different story. I mean, that was in 2010.
Was he authentic, or did you also think like that?
Actually, no, it was really interesting. He was actually authentic, but I need to probably say a few words about the background of that story. So it was 2010, it was presidential election, and I flew there to report about the presidential elections. And I was at the press conference, a governmental press conference. Most of the journalists were at the other press conference of the opposition party. And I went to this governmental press conference and I asked two questions which were not welcome, let me say it like that. So,
do you remember the questions? Or?
Yes, one was why Basil Rajapaksa, another brother of Mahinda Rajapaksa, was spending so much time in the election commissioner's office. And the other one was, I don't remember. Oh, no, the other one, I remember. The opposition candidate was in a hotel, Cinnamon Lakeside, and this hotel was totally surrounded by army. So I asked, why? So in the evening, I had the deportation letter in my hotel room.
Ah, okay.
And then I was like, okay, I read it, and it was like, okay, you have to leave within 3 days. And that was very much in the beginning when I started as a Southeast Asia correspondent. And I knew if I leave now, I'm not going to come back. I'm not going to be let in anymore. So I started informing my colleagues, and my colleagues were superb. You know, all these other journalists who started reporting about that case, that I'm getting deported for 2 questions. And it became so big that in the end, I got a phone call from the presidential office, and they said, yes, actually, you know, we think you can stay. And then since I had them on the phone, I said, fantastic, then can I have an interview with the president? And they were like, 2 hours later, they called me again and they said, okay, we pick you up in half an hour. Yeah, all right. So they picked me up and I came to the presidential office. And it was surreal. So there was a very long table. The president was sitting here. I was sitting here. And there were about 10 advisors sitting around. And it was a lunch meeting. And I put up my microphone and we started a conversation, President and I asked all the questions I wanted to ask, about the war against the Tamils, about all these civilian victims and so on. And the problem was he slurped so much because there was soup served as first course. And I couldn't actually use in the end all these recordings. And every time he was a bit dumb.
Okay.
I probably shouldn't say that, right? But yeah, anyway, his answers.
Are you planning to go back anytime soon?
So he was kind of relaxed, but his answers were empty. And whenever he started to say something, all the advisors started to say something else. And it was big chaos. That was my meeting with the president. How did he come to that?
Because politicians lack authenticity, was your opinion?
Yeah, but he was actually kind of authentic.
Right,
he was just kind of dominated by all these other guys. And what happened later then was they were like, all right, now we want to show you the beautiful sides of Sri Lanka. So they sent me on a, I think, 5-day tour with a private chauffeur through Sri Lanka. And the first stop was in Galle, where they put me on a whale watching boat with 21 Miss Slovakia candidates who had their photo shooting on the boat. And it continued like that. I mean, the entire story was really surreal.
Sounds like it.
But I could go back. So I went back 2-3 months later, and there was parliamentary elections.
Right.
And first they didn't want to give me the permission, the visa. And then I called them up and said, I had lunch with the president. What's the problem? And they said, oh, sorry. Yes, here's yours.
I want to move on to the third book, but just one more question on the soup.
On the soup. I don't remember which one it was.
Did you broadcast any seconds of his slurping? Because it's something, having the Sri Lankan president slurp on your microphone.
I did. I don't remember exactly, but I did do a story, obviously, about it.
Yeah.
And I wanted to send it as an interview. So this was impossible.
Sure. Because
there was so much noise and slurping on it. And his answers were cut in most of the parts because the advisors jumped in. But I think there was some slurping in the radio report.
Bit more serious. Earlier this month, a container depot exploded in Bangladesh, killing 40 people, injuring hundreds. It was filled with containers. The containers were filled with clothes heading this way, of course. And of course, my mind, when I read that, immediately went back to the story of Rosina in the third book you have here, Bis zum nächsten Monsoon. Rosina is a seamstress who survived the collapse of the 8-story garment factory in Bangladesh in 2013. That collapse killed over 1,100 people.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a bit about Rosina? And again, how did you get in touch with her and decided this is a story I should tell in this book?
I mean, this factory collapse was it was not the only factory collapse in the history of, in the garment history of Bangladesh, but it was just simply the biggest. So it couldn't be ignored anymore. It was in 2013, over 1,100 people died, over 2,000 got injured. And Rosina worked in that factory. Rosina joined the factory, not this one, but a different, she moved on to different factories when she was 12, because she comes from a poor family. And that's where you end up in Bangladesh. But what I want to say perhaps in the beginning, Rosina was extremely happy in the factory. She loved her job in the factory because she said this gave her and many women in the industry freedom, independence, because they earned their own money and they had friends in the factory. So she had her own network, while at home there was a lot of fighting and it was not great to be at home. So she loved her work in the factory. And when the factory collapsed, she was in the factory and she got unconscious. And then she woke up and she realized she was still alive, but she couldn't move because there was a pillar on her arm and she couldn't move. So it was like a heavy weight. And there was a hole at the bottom to her feet. And at some point she got discovered, and they tried to get her out. They couldn't get her out. They couldn't get her out for 2 days, for 3 days. And on the third day, she said, give me a saw that I can cut off my arm. And that's what she did, and she got out.
That's what she did.
That's what she did. That's what she did. And she got out, and I met her a few months later. What we do as journalists, as foreign correspondents, we always work, not always, but most of the time we work with stringers, fixers. These are mainly local journalists who translate for us. They have connections, they help us move around, they know where it's dangerous, where not, who is a good interview partner, who not. And I had a really good stringer. We worked together now for the last few years and went back to Rosina many times. And he said, let's go to this rehabilitation center where there are many victims who survived from the factory collapse. So we went there, and then they told us about Rosina. That's how we went to the slum at the side, at the back of, or at the edge of Bangladesh, of Dhaka, where we met Rosina. That's how I met her. And then she started telling me her story.
The book contains 5 other stories from Cambodia, Thailand, Myanmar, and the Philippines. Out of these 5 other stories, which is there anyone that was particularly challenging or perhaps rewarding to you, that you thought, well, this is really why I'm doing this? And
I mean, I think I can't really pick out one specifically, but what's really rewarding to me is that it completely changed my perspective. When I first went to these people, one survived the Khmer Rouge, Rosina, who survived the factory collapse. There's a drummer, English drummer, who survived drugs, became a monk. There's Delphine, who survived IS, hostage, being a hostage from IS. And when I went first time to them, I looked at them as victims. And now 10 years later, 11 years later, I look at them as my teachers, because what they really managed was to survive and live on and find new perspectives. So I think this is one of the answers I found to the question, how can we survive? How can we not kill ourselves because we get so depressed about what happened in our lives? And one thing I realized was that they managed to get out of this victimhood and victim perspective. They said, yes, it was horrible what happened to me, but if I'm a victim, I give all the power to those who victimized me, to the perpetrators. So I need to get out of this victimhood and this victim perspective. And all of them who survived, they managed to do that. And they really taught me that even in the darkest moment of your life, there is a way to see some light. I mean, there was, for example, Yuk Chang, who survived the Khmer Rouge.
Right.
And he lost most of his family in a little village where he had to survive these nearly 4 years of the Khmer Rouge time. And when I asked him how he looks back now, decades later, Khmer Rouge took over in 1975, how he looks back, he said, look, I don't remember the hunger, I don't remember the fear. What I remember most is the little flowers who grew out of the rice fields once we had harvested the rice. And these flowers were of such beauty that they helped me to continue living one more year and one more year. And this really taught me, I mean, in any situation in our lives, there is a way. We will see some hope, some light, and we will find ways to move on. But it's a question of perspective.
I want to move back to Verboten Lieder, the book on the Afghan singer Mina Amani, and talk a bit about the journalism and between. In these books, you have a lot of room to really tell these stories. That's of course different in if you have to do 2-3 minute radio pieces that you have to file to SRF or other companies you might work for. In this book, in Verboten Lieder, you refer to a bomb attack on a guest house in Kabul. in which a 10-year-old Afghan girl died. And you briefly give us your perspective on the cynical character of the news business, because this bomb attack made headlines abroad as well, because not just did the 10-year-old Afghan girl die, but a couple of foreigners died as well. You're right, that's the cynical character of the news business, that this makes headlines abroad because foreigners died in it, and that frustrates me every time. I was wondering, how do you deal with that frustration, and how do you prevent yourself from becoming cynical as well?
I think it's a really important question, right? Because especially in my business, there are a lot of alcoholics as well, and that comes from frustration.
Right.
There were times I just was super angry, and I think that's okay. You know, I think you should be angry at some point.
And who were you angry?
Sometimes at my editors. For example, in 2017, when the Rohingya crisis happened, I went to Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, where hundreds of thousands of refugees flooded in.
Right.
And they were like unbelievably traumatized. There was not enough food, there was not enough water. Then there was a refugee boat which sank, dozens got killed. And I had already been reporting a few days, and I called my office and said, look, I have to report about this boat, right? And I went to the hospital to meet survivors. And the answer was, no, we already had like 2 refugee stories now this week. We cannot put another one. That's enough. And I remember I got so angry, and that was the beginning of a crisis I had with these questions. Is journalism, what can we actually do? Is it just a cynical business in the end about money? And what I did was, I think I changed my perspective, and that helped me a lot. I changed the perspective in the way that in the beginning I thought it's the most important part of my job is to report for Switzerland or for my audience, that they get the news, that they understand what happens in the world. And after that, I realized probably the most important part of my job is to sit with a refugee and listen to his story and be there 100%. Because what I realized is that people really want to tell their story. They want to be heard. They want that their voices travel, and that people can't just say, oh, we didn't know it, right? And just telling the story. And I realized that with writing these books was probably also kind of a psychological process in just kind of letting the stories go, giving them to the paper and to the audience, and then letting it go and moving on. And so, yeah, today I feel that probably a big part is being there totally, and being frustrated sometimes, and being depressed sometimes, and just being that and then moving on. That's meditation, right? Not just to run, and not just to numb it by drinking or drugging or whatever. Hold it, just be with it. And then at some point it will pass.
But if I just can step back a little bit, that perspective doesn't necessarily reach the news desk in Zurich or in Bern, who decides on what items to air. They'll still say, we already had 2 refugee stories this week, so maybe your Rohingya are next week. How's your influence as a foreign correspondent working thousands of kilometers away, especially in a region like Southeast Asia, which broadly speaking, gets significantly less coverage than whatever happens in the US, for example. What's your influence, and how do you try to influence the decisions to get more airtime for the stories you find important from Asia?
I mean, the influence is by how you sell the stories, how you tell them. To be honest, now with all the budget cuts we have, it's getting much easier. That they actually are super happy for every story which comes. Yeah, but in the end, it's the decision of the editor. I mean, that's why I started writing books, right? To kind of reclaim my power. Right. And say, all right, then let me write these books. And then it's in my responsibility, in my power to see that these books get read and the stories get read, and travel out.
Now that you've been away from reporting for 2 months, was it 2.5?
Yes, yeah,
yeah.
End of March, beginning of April, yeah.
Do you notice stories from the region you've worked in yourself, South Asia, Southeast Asia? Do you see stories come by now in the news feeds that we're missing? I mean, they're in the news feeds, but they maybe just a headline, just an AP piece, instead of like a good story that tells a human story about what's going on.
I have to be honest and say I didn't consume so much news in the last 2 months like I did before as a reporter, but I mainly see what's missing, right? And that's what I know from Asia. I mean, there was not much reporting about the elections in the Philippines, which is like a super important election. There's no more reporting about what's happening in Myanmar, which again is still continuing. I mean, Min Aung Hlaing is still in power and they're still there. So I see what's not being reported. Yeah.
What would you tell a rookie foreign correspondent who from Switzerland who decides, okay, Karin Wenger is away there, so there's a lot of space to set up my own business and start selling stories from Southeast Asia to an audience in Europe and Switzerland. What advice would you give them?
First of all, go around to all the different editing houses or publishing houses and media houses and tell them that you go, that they know who you are. I mean, that's very important that they know have a personal connection. And then go, just do it, right? Go and travel and then find the stories and write them down. Because I hear many people who say, oh, we would love to travel. Oh, what a great job, foreign correspondent. Everyone can do it, but you need to do it. I mean, leave Switzerland, leave this nice little safe harbor. Go. That would be my advice.
Anyone can do it?
I think so. If you are curious, I think what's very important is that you are really curious about life. How do we live? How do other people live? Yeah, I think you need to be really curious. You need to want to know. And you need to, I mean, obviously you cannot be a 5-star girl. I mean, you need to be able to sleep in a hammock in the jungle.
Right.
So, yeah, but everyone can do it in that way. Yeah, I think so.
Can they contact you for any good hammock tips? Or
They can.
Okay, good. I was wondering, you moved from India to Thailand in 2016. What prompted that move? Was there?
Our contracts are 4 to 6 years.
Okay.
And I was already 6.5 years in New Delhi. And so it's time to move. And then they called me and they said, look, there's this new job in Southeast Asia. I'll be in Bangkok. Would you be interested? And I said, yes, of course. So
were you done yourself in India? Did you think, oh, it's time to move on? Or?
Yeah, I think it was good to move on.
Okay.
Because life in New Delhi is a battle and it does take a lot of energy. So moving to Bangkok, I moved into my new apartment in Bangkok and the internet was working. So I was like, wow. And I think this feeling kind of didn't leave me for the last 6 years because things were just so much easier. Internet was working, phones were working, you could meet people. So life was easier. Life was easier. Yeah.
We meet 10, 12 people up close in these books all together. Are you still in touch? Because the stories start, some of them over 10 years ago and go all the way up to pretty much this year.
Yeah.
Are you still in touch with most of them who you're able to be in touch with?
Yes, I'm in touch with those who speak English. Those who don't speak English, it's much more difficult because I always need a translator.
Right.
And so it becomes more kind of complicated to contact these people. Sometimes I write to my translators and I ask them, do you know what happened and how are their lives going on? And then there are 2 people in this book who didn't survive. So one was a contract killer who got killed and the other one killed himself.
Right. I see we have 2 questions online. Is anyone here have any questions? Yeah.
Do we need a... Oh, you record. Thank you very much. That was fascinating. One sees passion. And Daniel Walker was with the Foreign Ministry before for years in Europe area. That's I appreciate very much, Karin, you want to tell the big stories through small, beautiful stories. And for a journalist, it's absolutely the only thing. There is, however, also the side of, in a very small space, tell the big story. I work now together with a former colleague as a geopolitical coach. And when we have a client from industry, he wants to have a page and a half, that's all he wants, or she wants. Let me give you an example. Probably the best book ever written about Southeast Asia is Blood and Silk by Michael Vatikiotis, who probably knows.
I know the book,
And he condenses, it's a big book, but he condenses all in saying Southeast Asia has a smiling surface with a very violent, very corrupt underside. And will it be permissible to come to these general conclusions when you have to?
Yes, and in radio, I had to many times, right? Because it's 2 minutes, it's 3 minutes, and these are different formats, right? I had the bigger feature format where I could kind of tell the bigger stories, but I had 2 minutes where I just had to talk about geopolitics, and I would do that, but I would do it knowing that most of the time, and that's what I realize now on my book tour, because I get the feedbacks, all these geopolitical 2-minute stories, no one ever remembers them. But what people remember is Rosina who cut off her arm to be saved, and what this meant for the garment industry and what this might mean for my life by buying garments. So yeah, I'm not sure, is this an answer to your question or not?
There is an answer.
And obviously, I read a lot of geopolitical studies and whatever to prepare myself for the journeys. But in the end, here in Switzerland, my audience is really broad. And it's my mother, it's my grandmother. It's like, it's people, they are really not interested in this, I think so, in this big geopolitical story. And let me give you one example. Here in this book with Yuk Chang, right? Yuk Chang, survivor of the Khmer Rouge, became director of the center where they collected all these different pieces from the history for the Khmer Rouge Tribunal. He told me he did all of that to be successful, to get kind of the love of his mother. And then there was this scene where Christian Amanpour, the star journalist, came to Phnom Penh to interview his mother. And she asked her, "Are you proud of your famous and successful son?" And the mother said, "I don't care about success. I care about if he has eaten enough and if he is safe." And I think that's a really crucial insight, right? For many people here, we assume we need to know this, that the abstract, it's about abstraction, right? That's the abstract level. And many people can just be reached by the heart. You see what I mean?
Can I just, George, I
Short one.
appreciate what you say. With the Swiss in particular, sorry, I fully appreciate what you say, but with the Swiss in particular, they can travel to Thailand, they go to Bangkok, they can go to Angkor Wat, and sometimes you feel like telling them, you go to Thailand, but look at the smile and below it, sort of in a general way. Then they meet individual people, but then they are at least curious because sort of the cliches, Thailand is all happiness and warmth and to see, not to speak of Cambodia, which is an ongoing tragedy.
But this requires an interest. So people need to be interested and curious and open, that they want to know more than just the tourist spots. And it requires that you reach them. And what I'm saying is that different people can be reached at different levels. With you, probably an analytical geopolitical analysis is much better to reach you than my mother. My mother needs to, you see what I mean? My mother needs to be reached through a story to tell her it's not all smiles. So it's like different channels for different people, different stories for different people. But in the end, the goal is the same. It's the same. It's about telling the story beneath the story. It's about telling about the violence and what's behind the smile. Yeah.
Another questions over there. Meanwhile, if maybe short question online is if you've covered Vietnam, and if yes, what people should look out for for your coverage from Vietnam. Where can they find it, perhaps?
Yeah, Vietnam is another story which is a bit problematic because I went to Vietnam, and the problem is if you travel to Vietnam as a journalist, either you do it like officially with a journalistic visa, and then you have a minder on your side the entire time, which means you cannot cover anything which is real. I mean, you cover like the beauty and the tourism and so on. So I went to Vietnam a few years ago to cover about this huge environmental disaster. And I knew I could not do that if I go as a journalist, so I went as a tourist. I traveled around, met a lot of dissidents as well, a lot of people for 3 weeks. And then after 3 weeks, I got discovered. And then they basically picked me up and put me in the next plane back to Bangkok.
No lunch with the Prime Minister this time?
Actually, lunch, they brought me lunch, which was nice. And we argued about who pays the ticket, the return ticket, which was also funny. In the end, they paid.
Okay. Sir, you had a question?
Yes, what touches me about all your stories is how close you get. You get close to the people, you get close to the stories. And I was just wondering, I mean, in all these situations, there is also a question about risk you take by getting so close. How do you manage that risk? What is your way to decide this goes maybe too close, this is too dangerous in external factors, maybe also internal factors? What is your system to cope with that?
It's a lot of this gut feeling, I would say. And as you say, it's like there are different risks. There are emotional risks, there are physical risks. I mean, Afghanistan, it was a lot about physical risks. And part of it you can manage, part of it, it's just out of your hands. Because if a bomb explodes, you don't know where it explodes. But I think much more dramatic or much more crucial is the internal risk. So how, the same like my question, right? How do people survive? Right. And how do you manage? And what I discovered for myself is I needed a lot of little healthy islands. So that's what I did for myself. And I realized that I can create them anywhere I am. So for example, I was embedded with the American Army in Kandahar and also in Khost. So I did 2 embeds with the American Army. And it was a lot of stress. And all these soldiers I interviewed were hugely traumatized and depressed. And I was kind of the big sister, so they shared all of that. And what I often did was in the evening, I went into my sleeping bag, put on earphones, and I listened to beautiful music. And I think you need to kind of start to learn how to become resilient without shutting yourself off, because you need to be open. If you want to understand what a story means for a person, not just like on an intellectual level, you need to open your heart. And that brings some risk. And you can only deal with it with kind of getting back to, I often went to the sea, or I like water. I went diving, now sailing, walking at the beach, just to kind of ground yourself and stay healthy. It's important to stay healthy, physically and mentally. And there are different ways you have to learn how to do that. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
We have time for one more question.
Hi, Karin. I'm Maima. I was really curious about the title of your 3rd book. I just forgot about it now, but it's about something about monsoon.
This one here.
Yes. So I'm Filipino myself, but I haven't experienced monsoon since I was 10 years old. And we moved to Ireland where there's monsoon all the time. And I was wondering how you came up with that title, because this is a literary piece of text as opposed to journalistic articles that you write? Curious.
I think the books they also are not like strictly journalistic. You read them. I mean, I'm not sure. How would you describe them? It's kind of a mix, right?
There's some very value-adding personal reflections on how on the situation, on how you feel dealing with the situation.
It's much more transparent than just a journalistic piece.
Absolutely.
And Bis zum nächsten Monsoon, I came up with, because Rosina, when I met her, she said, okay, we meet next monsoon. So it's basically a phrase from her story, which I took as book title.
That's so lovely. Thank you.
We have a question on the books online. They're in German. Is there an English translation coming? Is someone asking?
If I find a sponsor.
Okay.
For the translation, it's very expensive to translate books, so it's really a question of money.
Thank you very much. Oh.
It'd be great if you can. You're trying right now.
I haven't been trying yet, but yeah, probably I should try, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So if you know a sponsor, let me know.
For now, the German editions are for sale here at the office with Karin. Thank you very much for your insights and your stories. And and through you, thank the people for sharing their stories, of course. We have a little token for you.
Oh, I thought that's from the bookshelf. Like, I was looking at it.
Thank you very much. Thank you.